the not so far future. So what we see here is more rumblings of war. And what's interesting about this China situation is that when you look at our current flashpoints with the Chinese, the obvious one is Taiwan. However, Taiwan could always choose to peacefully reunify with mainland China or the PRC. The South China Sea often gets left behind. So this is obviously the Philippines indicating they want cooperation in the area, probably because the Chinese merchant marine has been bullying and running their fishing vessels out of what should be their economic zone or even international waters. And what's funny about this story is this new president in the Philippines, Marcos, is exactly the opposite of Duarte, who was anti-American and like pro-Russian. So you can see how quickly that can shift. But that's a very high-level meeting for the Philippines to be getting. I think the Philippines in the South China Sea would probably be a minor partner. You would see Vietnam being probably one of the main partners, and Indonesia being greater military powers, obviously. But that's an interesting development. Now, this is a story from Defense News. Now, if you look at the composition of the American fleet, our carriers are pretty vulnerable and very expensive. So it would be correct, I would assume, for the Navy to look at a more littoral approach with smaller vessels, especially to combat the Chinese Navy, which is rapidly building up. Of course, with your Navy, you go to war with what you have. You're not going to be able to build ships to meet demand in a war like you would artillery rounds or artillery systems. And, even that's difficult with modern weapons. So it's definitely a smart option. Admiral Mike Gilday's prioritization of readiness spending on people, maintenance, parts, and training as a starting point. Caudill's plan is intended to turn that readiness into operational lethality. There are some problems that the Navy has that can't be solved in a single 5-year budget planning window, Caudill told Defense News in a March 30th interview in his Norfolk office. So it is, like I said, it's more of a long-term thing. A new One Atlantic concept, which is another piece of his plan, will help share ready naval forces across the Atlantic. That's weird to me because you would assume they would already have that kind of force structure there, but as a civilian, I wouldn't exactly know, unless I was an admiral, some kind of naval officer, what they had in place. And our submarines, as they're discussing it, those are very important. Probably would be the most effective arm that we have in combating a hostile navy. The one thing that the Russians do have that is threatening is that submarine force. And this will be readiness for more deployments, more demands on the Navy. Okay, this is a Dutch ship. So again, with our NATO allies, because when you look at the force structure between NATO and Russia in particular. Look at the Navy. It's the NATO Navy is about 1,000 ships. It's crazy. It's completely insane. There's nothing on the planet that could deal with that realistically outside of nuclear war. A lot of cutting edge discussion here about AI and cloud services. On to the obvious flashpoint, which is Ukraine. Now, what we've been seeing over the past year in Ukraine is the total decimation of Russia's offensive capabilities. First, you had the armored forces in Russia take the brunt of the casualties advancing on Kiev, as well as the VDV, the Russian paratroopers and Spetsnaz. They were all wrecked in that initial invasion because they were supposed to secure forward objectives. Ukrainians were going to just surrender and turn the country over to them, and then the armor would come in and take over. And of course, what happened was the Ukrainians threw them out of Kiev and Kharkiv, and in Bakhmut, Wagner was decimated. So the Russian offensive capabilities have been completely degraded to the point to where they're not likely to launch any sorts of offensives. And these small offensive capable forces like the VDV and the Wagner have been called upon to do more, and they've been shifted around the front willy nilly to do that. Of course, he came out recently and said he's pulling out, so now he's getting a all clear that he's going to get all of the ammo that he needs. It's quite bizarre that he did that. You would never see in a Western military like Blackwater. Imagine the Iraq War if Eric Prince had come out and said, our contractors are dying in Fallujah. We don't have enough weapons or up armored Humvees, and we're not going to continue going into that area until you provide us with those. That indicates a breach of discipline and the Russians not really having a professional military that is going to operate even in a public relations way on a united front, let alone on the actual front line. So you'll see here Russian forces evacuating town near occupied nuclear power plant. That's in Zaporizhia, where the Russians appear to be doing small evacuations. It's a open question whether the Ukrainians have enough air defense capability to really cover in advance. One of the big problems historically, it's a huge problem in any operation when you try to advance on the ground in open terrain without air cover. And if you look at the Zaporizhia Oblast, it is all flat. Same thing with Kherson when they've crossed the Dnipro. They've been doing that for a while. It's flat terrain, and the Russians have been using their version of a joint direct attack munition. So they've been putting kits on their bombs to make them more precise, and they've been more effective in their ability to strike at targets on the front. So if you look historically at militaries that advance when they don't have air cover, I mean, you've got a lot of examples for World War II. One of them, World War One, one of the reasons the Allies were able to carry out that 100 days offensive is because they wrested air superiority from the Germans and were able to strafe and conduct reconnaissance. So that's the first example, the earliest. Rommel famously realized the importance of air power because it's really wrecked him in North Africa. And Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge, anytime the Germans tried to do something that would have been operationally possibly successful, they were slaughtered by the Allied air power, where it was a ridiculously one-sided affair. The Russians don't have that kind of superiority, but they have enough to blunt, I would think. If the Ukrainians do have the degradation problems that were indicated in those leaked documents, that's going to prevent them from launching the counteroffensive, which kind of segues into this next story, which is Americans show impatience in the war with Ukraine, or impatience with the Ukraine war. Anecdotally, I live in a Republican area, and I don't know anyone who's pro-Ukraine or who thinks this is a good idea. Unfortunately, war fatigue is real in the United States. So we spent years in Iraq with arguably a positive result, but a result that wasn't what we were looking for. And we lost in Afghanistan. So people think that that is going to be the outcome here, when in fact the Ukrainians are fighting tooth and nail to retain their territory. They're the first allies that we've had in so long that have actually fought. So it's unfortunate that that war fatigue is real. It's also highly unfortunate that the United States is in this confrontational period with China, both economically and strategically, because that means that we're going to have to worry about our own stocks as well eventually. On the other hand, primarily in Ukraine, it's a ground infantry armor war, so you're not going to see as much demand for anti-ship missiles. The Black Sea Fleet is nothing more than like a flotilla. Our Navy could sail in there, and you could literally just send the Sixth Fleet in there, and they would just dominate and destroy the Russian Navy. I mean, it's a joke. But what you see here is some nuance in the opinions of Americans regarding the war. Largest cadre here they want the status quo, which would mean that 1/3 of Luhansk and Donetsk would remain Russian, and then the Crimea would remain Russian. For the Ukrainians, that's a problem, because one of the reasons the Ukrainians are fighting so hard for that Donbass region is its industrial power. That's where all of the industry in Ukraine, a lot of the arms industry was. So to lose that is a huge blow. To allow the Russians to continue to occupy Zaporizhia and Crimea is tantamount to economic suicide. It's cutting them off from the sea, where the only ports they really have are in Odessa and that surrounding area. So they can't do that. So they have to liberate that area just in terms of national survival. They can't let the Russians have Crimea, because if they let the Russians have Crimea, that's a launching point for another invasion. So what you have to look at is what conditions on the battlefield would allow the Ukrainians to talk to the Russians and conduct peace negotiations. The Russians have not been convinced that they might be convinced that they can't take over the whole country, but they haven't been convinced that they're not going to keep what they took. And that's the goal, I think, of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, is going to be to liberate one or two oblasts, whether they be Zaporizhia, Kherson, Luhansk, Opasatove, or in Donetsk. So they probably have enough combat power with those offensive brigades, like 9 or 10 brigades that they formed, to do that. And then it's a question of making the Russians come to the table and saying, hey, we have Crimea under fire control. We can cut it off. We can make it a death trap. And you're going to have to negotiate, in which case you'd have a Korea situation in Ukraine, which would be not optimal. We don't want that as an outcome, I don't think. But the Ukrainians just don't. I'm not sure there are enough Ukrainians to continue, even if they're killing 3 Russians for every Ukrainian that's losing. That's still not a winning calculus if the Russians keep drafting massive cadres of their population and putting them in uniform and saying, here's an AK and go fight. They'll just choke them with corpses. So, but this is more support than I would assume for a lot of these issues, because you have a lot of open voices in media, a lot of loud voices that are basically pro-Russian. I don't think that, and the victory for the Ukrainians probably has to happen in this year, because if you have a Republican sweep of the presidency in 2024, which is possible given Joe Biden's less than stellar performance, that president, in this case Trump, would probably be more inclined to force Zelensky to negotiate. And if he's not in a favorable position, then you're going to have a problem. So that's one of the things that's going to drive them to attack. And it's easy to say, oh, these people are stupid or they don't understand, but Ukraine has got enough military support to equate to the entire Russian defense budget. So it's evened up. I mean, that's a lot. But if the United States was not a player in providing that aid, you would not see a European country able to do so. They just don't have the defense infrastructure there. They don't have the fighter planes in reserve. Even erstwhile militarized countries like France and Britain, who are some of the better militaries in Europe, don't have enough. The Bundeswehr is basically incapable as a modern force. The big budget that was passed was really more modernization and readiness for them. You are seeing some weird suppliers like South Korea and Japan stepping in. South Korea famously providing weapons to Poland, which is historically crazy. I mean that's happening. That's truly a sign of the globalized world that we live in. So yeah, market drop in public preparedness, of course. It's a stalemate, so you're going to see these numbers change. I mean, right now it is a stalemate. Both sides have been trading operational victories. So you had Kiev. Well, you had the initial Russian gains, then you had the Kiev victory by the Ukrainians, and then you had the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk campaign where the Russians took it, which it's World War I level of progress. I mean, literally, it's a very tiny area in a place no one has heard of before this, most likely, unless you're somebody that studies the Eastern Front in World War II, or you're a Sovietologist, or you have some familiarity with Eastern Europe, in particular Ukraine. You're not going to know what that is. Then you had the Kharkiv and the Kherson counteroffensives, and now you have Bakhmut, where the Russians have basically taken the city for no particular reason other than to say they did it. So, really, it's an open question to see how things pan out.